There's an old saying in life, you can't go back. But when it comes to tabletop role-playing games, specifically Dungeons & Dragons, there's a good argument to be had as to why you might want to go back. I've been playing Dungeons & Dragons for a very long time, 38 years in fact, and I'm old enough to remember a time when Dungeons & Dragons was a very simple game, fueled by imagination and lots of ingenuity and creativity. Contrast that to now, where Dungeons & Dragons is very popular, and the game itself has become very bloated, full of rules, full of supplements, full of options. The game itself is a lot different than it was when I used to play it, when I was a younger boy. In today's video, I'm going to talk to you about where the game was, where it's at now, and possibly where it's heading in the future. In 1985, I was introduced to a game unlike anything I had ever played before. A friend of mine at school introduced me to Dungeons & Dragons. It wasn't long after that I was hooked, and I actually got my own set, the Dungeons & Dragons Basic Set, affectionately referred to as the Red Box Set. This game was a complete package: dice, Dungeon Master's Guide, and Player's Handbook, all rolled into one little box. And it was basically my tool and my entry point to this amazing game. That box set alone had enough content to fuel me right up until the next step in the evolution of Dungeons & Dragons for me was the blue box set known as the Expert Set. In all of the rules that came with both those sets was more than enough to power my imagination and my games for at least half a decade. It wasn't until I was introduced to Advanced Dungeons & Dragons where my desire to have more of the game and more to the game started to build. Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, of course, set me off on a whole nother path and opened up my eyes to a world of additional compendiums, more monster manuals, more expansion books, world box sets. Just the sky was the limit as far as content goes back in the 80s. Of course, as we know now, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons sunsetted and we started getting editions. 2nd edition, 3rd edition, 3.5 edition, 4th edition, and of course what we know now as 5th edition. With each new edition, more rules were added, more options were added, and of course the inevitable barrage of more and more books to buy. But the question that I had throughout all of those years was, did it improve the game? Did all of those supplements and all of those add-ons improve the gameplay experience and improve my ability to actually tell compelling stories and have exciting adventures? I'm going to tell you right now that the answer for me was no. The game as it was in a very simplified state. It actually relied more on the Dungeon Master in the early years to make interpretations of the rules because the rules themselves weren't as robust as they are now. If players wanted to do something that wasn't covered in the rules, you as the Dungeon Master would have to make something up. Now, of course, nowadays they refer to that as homebrew, and there seems to be a little bit of a stigma associated with anybody who deviates from the rules and initiates a homebrew, almost as though homebrew wasn't real Dungeons & Dragons, it was just the Dungeon Master making stuff up. Suffice to say that the simplicity of the rules back in 1985 and beyond was what made the game really powerful for me. It gave me control over the game, and very rarely did I have players pushing back against me because of the established rules being sort of the baseline on how you had to play Dungeons & Dragons. I'm not convinced that things have gotten better. Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is an amazing product. Everything just clicks. It's smooth, it's streamlined, and the gameplay just flows. Now, moving outside of that core set of rules, however, is where things get a little bit tricky in its current state. Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition currently is a massive product filled with a million different options for players to take advantage of. And it's important to note that every time a new supplement gets published, or every time a new rulebook gets added to the mix, players assume that that becomes a part of the D&D DNA. So as a Dungeon Master, when you used to have a lot of creativity and a lot of control, the minute you start deviating from said established rules, players sort of get their back up a little bit. And the whole idea of Dungeons & Dragons now is, what can I do? What more can I add to my character? And a little bit of power creep starts to come in, and a lot of metagaming has taken over Dungeons & Dragons. The game itself is no longer really about the imaginative play and the storytelling, but how do I build characters that can be optimized and can win the game that I'm playing against my Dungeon Master? You notice I said against my Dungeon Master. There's this dynamic at work now with Dungeons & Dragons that is well beyond the imaginative storytelling days that I used to experience and used to tell, and more about how do I create the best possible build and how do I come out ahead in this game. Dungeons & Dragons is in a different state than when I was a teenager for sure, and the game itself is losing a little bit of its sort of mysticism, a little bit of its allure, if we will, and has become more of a meta game and more of like a board game style game, and how do I win this game and how do I get better using the options that are available to me now. Of course, it doesn't help that Wizards of the Coast is just plowing ahead with supplement after supplement, adding more and more and more and more, and the game quite literally has become bloated to the point where it's barely recognizable to old school gamers like myself. Let's hope that the future reverses some of this trend and brings it back to basics. I recently came across a Kickstarter for a game called Dungeon Dwellers by Reaper Miniatures. The game positioned itself as an old school RPG with modern design sensibilities, and it got me thinking, can D&D come back from where it currently is, and can it do so without alienating all of the current generation of gamers? The answer to that is tricky. I, on one hand, don't think it's possible. I think that Wizards of the Coast have basically created a monster. They're just going to have to keep rolling it out like they have been over the past few years with Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. The current player base seems to want this style of game, and I don't know if it's actually within their best interest to move back to a more simpler style of game without losing all of the success they've had already. I think at this point it's safe to assume that Dungeons & Dragons will continue to get bigger, it will continue to have more options, everything but the kitchen sink is going to get thrown at it. Maybe even the kitchen sink. But in this case, that's okay, because the current generation of gamers, they enjoy that. That's what they want. I think at the end of the day is, just like I said at the beginning of this video, you can't go back. But maybe there's alternatives. So if the current state of Dungeons & Dragons and where it's going is not to your liking, I don't think the idea is that you need to necessarily jump on board each new version of the game that comes along. The beauty of tabletop role-playing is that all this product still exists. You can dig it out of your gaming closet and start playing it immediately today. In fact, you can even take D&D 5th edition and, heaven forbid, homebrew and downgrade the game to a little bit more of a basic state, just to keep your sensibilities about you and keep what you like about the game intact. For all you old school gamers out there, dust off some of those old books. Try and reinvigorate it with a new perspective from when you were younger. The challenge that you're going to have, however, is overcoming that mentality that the latest version of Dungeons & Dragons is the de facto version that you need to play. Finding a group of players who are willing to embrace an older version of the game is really going to be tricky in this day and age. So whatever version of Dungeons & Dragons you're playing today, I hope you're having fun. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you soon.
Those days have come and gone.
Perhaps not.
Before you go, I need your help. I'm trying to grow the exposure of what we do here at Maverick Games. My goal is to actually bring information to parents and students around the world in hopes that they can see gaming as a path forward for learning, academics, and even support of neurodivergency. Please subscribe, make sure you click on those notifications, and I hope that you'll find content here that will be helpful for you and maybe others. Thank you very much, and thanks for tuning in.